All right, let's dive into some really mind-bending stuff, shall we? We're talking about intentionality today, something that's fascinated philosophers for ages.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge one.
And specifically, we're looking at how philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome, those early thinkers,
Hmm.
wrestled with this concept.
Yeah.
We're talking pre-Socratics all the way to the Stoics.
Right.
So a whole bunch of text to sift through, trying to understand how they tackled this whole idea of the aboutness of our thoughts, what our thoughts are about,
Hmm.
how our thoughts can be directed at things.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing when you stop to think about it,
Which
right?
really is.
Like, we just take for granted that our thoughts, beliefs, desires, all those mental states we have, they can be about things. But, like, how does that even work?
Right. I mean, how can I even think about a unicorn if there's no unicorn out there to think about?
Exact.
How can my mind grab onto something that doesn't even exist in the real world?
That's exactly the kind of question that really puzzled those ancient philosophers. And, trying to answer it, it led to some really interesting turns in the history of philosophy. It's a wild ride.
It really is. So where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with a big name, Parmenides.
Okay, Parmenides, the pre-Socratic philosopher.
Yeah, he's a bit of a tough nut to crack, but he argued that you can't even think about or talk about stuff that doesn't exist.
Wait, really?
Yeah. And his reasoning was basically, well, if you can think about it, then it must be real in some way. If you can think about it, it has to exist.
So if I'm sitting here imagining a dragon breathing fire and all, you're saying that somewhere, somehow, a dragon has to exist.
Well, that's what Parmenides would say, yeah. It's like, in order to think about it, it has to have some kind of being.
That seems a bit extreme, doesn't it?
It does, right? But it shows you this really fundamental tension in how we understand thought. On the one hand, we think, oh, thinking is about making something present to our minds,
Right, we bring it to mind.
Yeah, but then how can you make something present that isn't even there to be grasped, that doesn't exist?
Yeah, that's a real head scratcher.
It is. And so Parmenides, he just said, well, thought, it's got to be limited to what actually exists.
But wouldn't that mean we couldn't think about any fictional characters or hypothetical situations? All those wild thought experiments philosophers are always coming up with.
Exactly.
It seems like Parmenides is really putting the brakes on the power of thought here.
He is. And it does seem super counterintuitive, like you said.
Yeah.
And of course, not everyone agreed with him, thankfully.
Well, that's a relief. So who came along and offered a different perspective?
All right, so we've got another big name coming up, Protagoras.
Okay, another major figure in ancient Greek philosophy.
Yep, and he kind of flipped Parmenides' idea on its head.
Oh, how so?
Instead of saying that thought is limited to only what exists, he said, well, whatever someone experiences, that's true for them. No room for error there.
So if I think the sky's green because, I don't know, I'm wearing some weird sunglasses that make it look that way,
Right.
that's true for me, even though everyone else sees it as blue.
That's exactly what Protagoras is getting at.
That's quite the relativistic view of truth.
Yeah.
Like, truth depends entirely on the person.
It is. It's very relativistic. Protagoras is pushing a subjectivist view of truth here. It's all about the individual perceiver. And this has some pretty big consequences for intentionality.
Yeah, I can see how this gets tricky fast.
Yeah.
So if truth is relative, depending on the person,
Right.
then what my thought is about might also be relative.
Exactly.
So my green sky, it's a valid object of thought for me, even though it doesn't match up with what everyone else sees.
Yeah, that's what Protagoras seems to be suggesting. It's like the act of thinking, it actually creates, in a way, the object of that thought. Like, our minds have this power to shape our own realities.
Okay, so we've gone from thought being trapped by what exists to the idea that maybe it can create its own objects.
It's wild, right?
It really is. Are there any other crazy perspectives from this era that we should be thinking about?
Oh, we can't forget about Gorgias.
Gorgias, another one of those sophists.
Right, those guys who love to challenge all the usual ways of thinking. And Gorgias, he argued that we can easily think about things that don't even exist at all. Like, imagine a chariot racing on the sea. Doesn't make sense, right?
Right, chariots on the sea. Definitely not a thing.
But we can still picture it.
Yeah, I can picture it in my mind.
And this really throws a wrench into that whole idea that thought is directly tied to reality.
So, according to Gorgias, our minds can go anywhere, even beyond what's actually real.
Exactly. It's freeing in a way, right? Our imaginations have no limits. But it also raises these questions about how reliable our thoughts actually are.
Yeah, how can we be sure that any of our thoughts are really about anything real if we can so easily think about stuff that doesn't exist?
It's a good question.
All right, so we've got Parmenides saying thought is stuck with what exists. We've got Protagoras saying, nope, truth and the objects of thought, they might just depend on the individual person. And then we have Gorgias saying, our imaginations are limitless.
It's a lot to take in, right?
It is.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? This is already getting pretty
Well,
complicated.
this is where our next big thinker comes in. Plato.
Plato, the student of Socrates.
That's right. And he really grappled with all these different viewpoints, and he tried to come up with his own way of explaining how falsehood is even possible.
Right, because if we can only think about things that actually exist, how could we ever be wrong about anything?
Exactly. It seems like falsehood actually needs the possibility of thinking about things that aren't real, that aren't actually the case.
So how did Plato approach this problem? What was his take?
Well, in one of his dialogues called the Theaetetus, he uses some really vivid analogies, to try to explain how this whole thing works. He compares our thoughts to signet rings making impressions in wax, for example, or birds being caught in an aviary.
Wow, those are some pretty striking images. I'm curious to hear more about those.
Oh, yeah.
So first, the wax tablet. How does that help us understand false beliefs?
Okay, so imagine a wax tablet, right? And you press a signet ring into it. Plato's idea is that our thoughts, our perceptions, they leave these traces in our memory, just like those impressions in the wax.
So like mental pictures.
Kind of, yeah. They become these signs or representations of the objects we've thought about or the things we actually seen.
Like little models of the real world stored in our minds.
In a way, yeah. But the problem comes when we try to combine those memory traces with new stuff we're experiencing.
Okay, I'm listening.
If the old trace doesn't really fit with the new perception, you get this mismatch, and that's where false beliefs pop up.
Like trying to shove a square block into a round hole?
Yeah, exactly. It just doesn't work.
But I can see how that analogy might break down a bit.
It does, yeah.
I mean, I can have a false belief about something abstract, like a mathematical concept.
Right.
I've never actually perceived it the same way I perceive, a tree or a bird.
That's a great point. And Plato recognized this limitation too.
He did.
Yeah. So he comes up with another analogy, the aviary. Imagine our mind is like this big aviary, and it's full of birds, and each bird represents a thought.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So grabbing the wrong bird would be like having a false belief.
You got it. Like, we reach for the thought we think we want, but we might end up with a different one instead.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it. So sometimes we just make mistakes in grabbing the right thought.
Right. And this analogy really gets at the fact that our minds are full of all these different thoughts, and sometimes we just mess up in accessing or retrieving the right one.
These analogies are definitely helpful, I have to say. I can see how they give us a way to picture how false beliefs could happen. But do they really solve the problem?
That's a good question. And even Plato himself, he recognized that these models have their limits. He wasn't claiming to have totally explained how false beliefs work,
Oh,
but he did make some real progress. And one of his most important insights is this idea of other believing.
other believing. I don't think I've heard that term before. What does that mean?
So it's this idea that when we have a false belief, it's because we're mixing up one thing for another.
Oh, okay, I see.
Like, for instance, if someone believes that the evening star isn't the morning star.
Right, Venus, same planet, but it appears at different times.
Exactly. So you see, they're mistaking one object for another.
Right, and I could totally see how someone could get confused.
Totally. And Plato's point is that this kind of mistake, it means we actually have some kind of representation of both things in our mind.
Oh, so to get it wrong, we need to have some grasp of both the right thing and the wrong thing, even though we're jumbling them up.
Precisely. We're mixing them up.
So even when we're wrong, our thoughts are still about something, even if they're not about the right thing.
That's a great way to put it. And that's really at the heart of intentionality, right? Even our mistaken thoughts, they're still pointing towards something.
They still have that aboutness, even if they're misdirected.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg with Plato. He goes on to develop even more nuanced ideas about falsehood and intentionality.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
But I think we're going to have to pause here for now. We've covered a lot of ground already.
We have.
We've gone from thinking about whether we can think about what doesn't exist all the way to how our minds make mistakes and misidentify things.
It's a journey, for sure.
It is. And we'll pick up this thread next time, exploring more of Plato's ideas and then diving into Aristotle's take on all of this.
Can't wait. So last time we left off with Plato, and he was struggling with this idea of how to explain falsehood, especially in the context of this other believing thing where we mix up one thing for another.
Right, right. Like we were saying, even our wrong beliefs, they still have this aboutness, this directedness towards something.
Exactly. That's the core of intentionality. But Plato didn't just want to identify the problem, he wanted to solve it.
Of course, that's what philosophers do, right? Always trying to find solutions. So how did he approach it?
Well, he tackles it head on in another one of his dialogues, The Sophist. And here he moves away from those analogies we talked about, the wax tablets and the birds, and he starts looking at language itself.
Oh, interesting. Language.
Yeah, he thinks the structure of language can actually give us some clues about falsehood and, by extension, about intentionality. He argues that falsehood doesn't come from thinking about nothing. It comes from this mismatch between what we're talking about and what we're saying about it.
So instead of saying we're talking about something that doesn't exist, he's saying we're just saying the wrong things about something that does exist.
You got it. It's not about the subject of our thought being non-existent, but about the predicate, what we're saying about it being off.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like that example with the evening star and the morning star.
Exactly. We're not talking about nothing. We're just misidentifying Venus.
Right, right. We're just getting it wrong.
And what's cool here is that Plato connects this to how language works. He thinks that understanding language can actually teach us about falsehood and about intentionality itself.
Okay, I can see how that might be the case, but
Yeah.
how does that work exactly? How does looking at the structure of language help us with this?
Well, let's think about a really simple sentence like, the cat is on the mat. For this sentence to even make sense, we need two things.
Okay, two things.
First, we need a subject, in this case, the cat. This refers to a specific thing, right?
Right, a cat.
And then we need a predicate, is, on that, which tells us something about that cat.
So for a statement like that to be true, the cat actually has to exist. And what we say about it, the predicate, has to accurately describe that cat.
Precisely. So falsehood pops up when there's a disconnect between these two pieces. The subject might refer to a real thing, but the predicate might be getting it wrong.
So if the cat is actually like, napping in a sunbeam, the statement, the cat is on the mat, would be false, even though there really is a cat.
Exactly. We're not talking about nothing. We're just making a false claim about a real entity.
This is really interesting. So Plato's kind of sidestepping that whole issue that Parmenides ran into, right?
He is. We're not dealing with the problem of thinking about nothing. We're dealing with the problem of saying something wrong about something that exists.
I like it. It brings some real clarity to how falsehood works. But does this only apply to language itself? What about beliefs that we have, internally? We don't always think in complete sentences.
Ah, that's a great question. And Plato actually does apply this idea to belief more broadly.
He does.
Yeah. He sees belief as this kind of internal statement, like a statement that the soul makes to itself, so to speak. So the same logic still holds.
So even when we're not speaking out loud, our thoughts still have this structure, this subject-predicate structure.
That's how Plato sees it, yeah. And that's important because for a belief to be false, it has to be false about something.
Right. It needs to have that target, that subject, to get wrong.
Exactly.
This makes so much sense. Plato's really getting at the core of how our minds connect with reality, even when we make mistakes. But where does Aristotle fit into all of this? Did he follow a similar line of thinking?
Well, Aristotle definitely builds on some of the groundwork that Plato laid out, but he develops his own unique approach to intentionality. And a key concept for him is what he calls phantasmata.
Phantasmata. That sounds kind of like phantoms or fantasies. What are they exactly?
You can think of them as a kind of internal representation, almost like mental images or impressions that stand in for the actual objects in our thoughts.
Oh, okay. So if I'm thinking about a giant squid, even though I've never actually seen one in person,
Right.
I have a phantasma of a giant squid in my mind.
Exactly. It's like having this mental picture or this model of the squid that lets you think about it, even though you don't have that direct sensory contact with it.
So this sounds a bit like Plato's idea of those impressions in the wax, right?
There are definitely some similarities there. Both Plato and Aristotle, they knew that we need some kind of internal representation to make thinking possible. But Aristotle, he takes those phantasmata and he really develops them in much more detail.
So they're more than just fleeting mental images.
Yeah, they're a fundamental part of how our minds work.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
But if all our thoughts are based on these internal representations, how do we know that they really correspond to anything real out there in the world?
That is a great question. And it's something that Aristotle was definitely aware of. He emphasized that phantasmata aren't just random images floating around in our heads, they come from our actual experiences of the world.
So even though they're mental constructs, they're still grounded in reality.
Precisely. Aristotle's trying to bridge this gap between our internal thoughts and the external world. He's saying that our thoughts, they're ultimately based on those phantasmata, which have been formed through our senses, through our interactions with real things.
Okay, that's good to know. Our minds aren't totally off in their own world, even when we're thinking about crazy stuff or imagining things. But it seems like both Plato and Aristotle were really focused on explaining how we can think about things that are absent or that don't exist. What about just thinking about things in general? What makes our thoughts about the specific things are about?
That's a really sharp observation. You're getting at this more fundamental question about the very nature of intentionality.
Yeah, like what is it that makes my thought about, a cat, about a cat, and not about something else?
Exactly. And this is a question that later philosophers, especially the Stoics, really wrestled with.
Oh, the Stoics. Okay, well, I'm definitely eager to hear what they had to say about it, but I think we'll have to save that for our next installment. We've already had a lot to think about today.
We have.
Okay, so we're back, and we're finally getting to the Stoics. We've seen how Plato and Aristotle tried to crack the code of intentionality and falsehood, but you said the Stoics had this really radical view. What made their approach so different?
Well, they took this whole idea of thinking about things that don't exist and just ran with it. They completely rejected the idea that only things that exist can be objects of thought.
So for them, it's totally fine to think about unicorns. Just as valid as thinking about, I don't know, this coffee cup.
Exactly. They didn't think existence was a requirement for something to be an object of thought. They thought something was the most fundamental category, and that even included things that don't exist in the usual way.
So a unicorn might not exist out there in the world, but it's still something for the Stoics. It's not just nothing.
Right. And they actually use the term phantasmata, just like Aristotle, for these non-existent somethings. But they took things a step further. They really dug into the role of language and concepts in all of this.
Okay, I can see how language would be important. It's how we categorize and make sense of the world, so it makes sense that they'd focus on it to understand how our thoughts work.
That's right. They believe that our words actually signify these abstract objects called lecta. Lecta is the plural of lekton, which means sayable. Think of them like the underlying meanings or content of our thoughts and our speech.
So the lecton of cat would be like the concept of cat, that mental category that lets us identify and think about cats even when there's no actual cat around.
Exactly. And here's the crucial part. The Stoics believed that lecta are what make our thoughts intentional. They're what give them that aboutness we've been talking about. It doesn't matter if the thing exists or not. What matters is that our thought is connected to a lecton, to a concept.
So this gives them a really powerful way to explain how we can think about real things and things that don't exist. Our thoughts are grounded in these lecta, these units of meaning, regardless of whether they correspond to something in the real world.
That's the beauty of the Stoic approach. But it raises a really interesting question about animal thought. If lecta are so tied to language, can animals who don't have language like humans still have intentional thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, a dog might bark at a squirrel, but does that mean it has the lecton squirrel in its mind?
It's a tricky question, but surprisingly, the Stoics thought even animals have thoughts with content, even if they can't express them in words.
Really? How do they explain that?
Well, remember how we talked about causal interaction? The Stoics believe that even the most basic causal interaction involves a lecton. When a body acts on another body, it makes a lecton true.
Okay, I think I need an example here. So if a ball rolls and hits a wall, there's a lecton involved in that.
Exactly. And since they had a causal theory of representation, meaning they thought perceptions are caused by objects acting on our senses, this meant that animal perceptions involved lecta too.
So when my dog sees a squirrel, the squirrel is causing a change in my dog's senses. And for the Stoics, that means there's a lecton involved. My dog is having a thought with the content squirrel, even though it doesn't have a word for it.
That's a great way to put it. It's a pretty radical view of animal cognition, right? It suggests their mental lives are more complex than we might think.
This whole lecta concept is fascinating, but it's also really complex. If even simple interactions have lecta, wouldn't the world be just overflowing with these abstract entities?
That's a question that's kept philosophers busy for centuries. The nature of lecta is still debated today. Are they mind independent out there in the world like Plato's forms, or do they depend somehow on our minds and our ability to grasp them?
Wow, big questions. It seems like the Stoics gave us just as many new puzzles as they solved old ones.
That's often the case in philosophy,
Yeah.
but I think that's part of what makes it so engaging.
Absolutely. So, where does all of this leave our listener? What's the takeaway from our deep dive into intentionality?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that even something as seemingly basic as thinking about stuff turns out to be incredibly complex when you really start digging into it.
It really is.
These ancient philosophers gave us all these different perspectives on how our thoughts connect with the world, and they really highlight the challenges in understanding both intentionality and falsehood.
It's been an incredible journey from Parmenides to the Stoics, and it's clear that this exploration of intentionality doesn't stop here. I mean, there are centuries of philosophical thought on this that we haven't even touched.
That's true. But hopefully our listener feels equipped to go out and do some exploring on their own. Who knows, maybe they'll even come up with their own theory of intentionality.
I wouldn't be surprised. And if they do, we hope they'll let us know. Until then, keep those minds thinking.